This video is being released on the 27th of October 2017, exactly 7 years since the release of Lionhead Studios' last Fable game, or at least the last Fable game to count. I've been playing a lot of the Fable series recently, re-immersing myself with what used to be my favourite role-playing franchise, starting with the anniversary edition of The Lost Chapters, and immediately skipping to the third, because for some reason the second just wasn't released on PC, which is a shame. Fable 1 was the best RPG I properly played for the Xbox One. No, not that piece of shit, the real Xbox One. I vividly remember the journey and all the steps I took to get to the end of the game. Everything about this game struck chords in me. The beautiful art style coupled with an equally beautiful and sometimes even chilling soundtrack, the lovable characters, the combat, the setting, this game resonates with me. And I was more than happy to play the game to death even after the final credits rolled. I remember being so stoked to find out that if you wait out the credits you can continue the game as long as you like, and this was before the Lost Chapters, so it's not like this was just a thing that just happened. Speaking of which, I remember the Lost Chapters being a great expansion, much like Broken Steel was for Fallout 3, but I think Lionhead missed a great chance to fix a lot of the stuff with it. Re-releasing the game with a bunch of new endgame content instead of just sprinkling in stuff the first game was missing was a bit of a dumb move. But I won't be talking about any Molyneux conspiracies or bad industry moves by Lionhead today. I just want to talk about Fable 3 and why my first playthrough after years struck me differently to the first time. Picture this. It's Christmas 2010. You are a little Leonard opening his Christmas haul to find 2 CD case sized presents. You eagerly open them up, you know it's going to be what you asked for. It's Fable 3 and Halo Reach. Both games will become the last true installments to franchises you know and love, but you don't know that yet. You run upstairs after dinner, set yourself up and play some video games on your old ass Xbox 360. You play a couple matches of Halo and that's all good, the game's great, but you really want to play Fable because it's been years since you got your fix of Lionhead goodness. 12 hours later, you finish the game. Yep, I've played this game for 12 hours straight on Christmas Day 2010 and it left a bad taste in my mouth. You could argue that I rushed through it and that the game is meant to be taken slowly, but then again I'd argue that I did take things slowly. It's just that the story is so lackluster, there's no real emotional attachment to anyone or anything, and that there's no reason for you to do anything other than bust out all the quests one by one. It's not even like the game could take a while due to difficulty, since you, like in Fable 2, can't fucking die, and you cut through enemies like a butter to hot knife. I want to take a moment to talk about that real quick actually. It was a big gripe I had with Fable 2 as well, but at least in Fable 2 they had the decency to grant you a health bar so you could see how close you were to being knocked out. But in Fable 3 there's nothing. No health bar and barely any indication that you're about to be knocked out except for some stupid vignette and a grayscale filter. In the 9 hours it took me to finish my playthrough this time around, I was knocked out a grand total of 3 times. 3. One of which I let myself get knocked down just to see what the repercussions were, and surprise surprise, they aren't very punishing. Now there is a challenging mode in the PC, which is the mode I started playing through, but the only significant difference is that the health doesn't auto-recharge. Given that the game had a death mechanic, I'd have played through the entire game like this, but health potions aren't exactly in abundance. I mean, I only ever found a couple lying around or in chests in the world, and the prospect of getting hit and then having to deal with the stupid fucking low health effects until I healed up just seemed annoying to me, so I turned it back down to normal. In Fable Anniversary I died quite a few times. I mean, since the enemies don't scale and you can't take much punishing without knocking back a ton of potions until later on in the game. I mean, thankfully potions are everywhere in Fable 1, so this wasn't too bad. I enjoyed the difficulty, and I didn't mind seeing the game over screen since the checkpoints in the game are fair. It's a weird thing to say that I enjoyed dying in one game more than I did another, but in this context it needs to be said. Anyways, what about the rest of the game? Putting aside all the technical issues and poor design choices for a moment, what about the good stuff? Well, thankfully there's a lot of good things about this game. The controls are thankfully very playable and responsive, nothing new there. I've never had any issues with how Fable games play. It also needs to be said that even though the combat is unbalanced in the sense that magic is very OP, there's a lot of fun to be had. It slows the pacing down so you don't swing as quickly as you do in Fable 2, but speeds it up by letting you kill things in a few hits. It's still not Fable 1's level of gameplay where you need to have sharp reaction times to roll and block and the pressure's on a lot, but it's fun no less. Then again, I never really felt any pressure to roll or block since you can take a lot of damage before you air quotes die, and as far as I'm aware there's no armor modifier either. Getting past that, the animations have also aged really well too. I love how smooth the transitions between them are. Smooth is definitely a term I'd use for this game. I mean, I'm running it on a good PC and a 144Hz monitor, and technically this game looks and feels fantastic. The art style for Fable has always been a staple of what set it out from its competitors, and for a lot of the game, the same charm is really there. But I'll talk about the art style of the game some more later. Another thing I like is the writing. Even though the story has serious issues, which again I'll get to later, the writing for this game's characters can at times be genuinely funny, and I don't remember a single time where I thought the dialogue was as unbearable as everyone says. The Fable games have always had this satirical and self-aware style of writing with wacky character tropes backed by great voice acting, which by the way is top quality in Fable 3. They had a really great all-star cast for this game. Voice acting is a small but insanely significant factor in what improves the game's writing. As said by Shammy, a poor joke told well can still get good laughs and vice versa. A lot of the voice acting for the first Fable was lackluster, but given that this was released in a time where fully voice acted RPGs were in their infancy, this can be forgiven, and they definitely improved on it since then. I very much enjoyed a lot of the side quests in the game, especially the ones that made me forget I was playing as the King of Albion. Speaking of which, let's talk about that, since this is definitely the biggest problem I have with the game. In the first two games, you start out as a child and work your way through the years. Your character ages the more time you spend in the game. It's one of the only things Molyneux promised that we kind of got in the end, though it doesn't really have any effect on gameplay. It's nice to see your character's progression from a young naive teenager into a grizzled old warrior. In Fable 3, you start as a teenage emo, and you pretty much end as a teenage emo, but with a crown on your head. I'm repeating stuff my favourite hot boy trademark Naked Jakey's already said about Fallout 4, but the decision to include a voice actor for the character you play was a serious misstep in my opinion. My favourite game in the Elder Scrolls franchise, and also my favourite game of all time, is Oblivion. Part of the reason being it sets up your character in a way that gives you the foundations for a backstory instead of just making one up for you. You wake up in a prison, the reason why is unbeknownst to you. The cell you wake up in just so happens to be the one with the exit route the Emperor uses. 10 minutes later, you've been given an ambiguous quest and you're out in the world. From here you can do anything, and there's no immediate sense of urgency to impede on your freedom of choice or pressure you to doing the main quest. There's absolutely no reminder of the fact that you need to go talk to Joffrey besides the odd comment about the Emperor's death. Subsequently, Skyrim is my least favourite of the games, because it does none of that. It starts you out in an ambiguous way, sure, but then you're immediately met with lots of pressure from the NPCs and the general direction of the game to go and tell your ball boy that there's some dragons and shit roaming around. In Oblivion, Coral is slammed in one corner of the map you don't even need to visit if you don't want to, but in Skyrim, Whiterun will very likely be the first city you visit because it's the closest to Riverrun. This strikes me as narrative handholding. The game isn't forcing you to go along with it, but you feel so inclined to, and the start of Fable 3 is so reminiscent of this. You don't start out as the first two games do. In Fable 1, you watch your village get raided and go to Hogwarts School of Bald Dudes and Dysentery, where you learn to be a hero, and from there you're free to take on quests, play coin golf and bang villages at your own leisure. And in the second, you watch your sister get killed, and you're raised in the gypsy camp where you learn the ways of the world, and from there you're free to take on quests, play shitty replacements to the best pub game in the world, and bang even more villages at your leisure. In the third game, you start off as the Prince of Albion. Your brother is kind of a dick, and kills either your girlfriend or some protesters in the opening 10 minutes of the game. You leave, and from there you have to start a revolution by talking to people and make money through pie making. There's something so inherently restrictive about starting roles within role-playing games that ruins the experience for me. It's why I never bothered finishing Fallout 4. While the first two games have a linear starting point, there are lots of ways you can go and things you can do immediately afterwards, and the only thing pushing you towards the end of the story is your interest and your genuine want to complete it. It's a formula that has been successful in many Western RPGs. Even The Witcher 3, which is another game that thrusts you into a set role, manages to incorporate the same, if not better pacing in its story as the first two Fables, by not having to artificially push you down the road to the end goal through constant reminders of what you need to do. Beyond the poor start of the story and the role that is forcibly thrust upon you, the characters in the game, while possessing a lot of typical tropes, manage to be appealing in their own way. You have Logan, your brother, who is established to be the villain of the game almost immediately, or so you think, who is universally described as a tyrannical leader. His attitudes and lines are delivered really well, and he supports his role fantastically. I like the way they set him up by making you choose who to kill in the beginning of the game. It hits you with that classic train track dilemma. Is one innocent life you care about worth more than 5 you've never met? It's a choice that has no significant impact on the story, but lets you know that he isn't fucking around. You have Walter, who is sort of like your family bodyguard who fought with your mother/father, your character from Fable 2. He's written with a very good sense of humour, he'll often crack jokes about his old age or the places you go together throughout the game, and his lines are once again delivered really well. Teresa makes her third appearance as the Blind Seer, but she's significantly less important in this game than she is in the first two, which I personally hated. If you're going to go the lengths of having her in the game, knowing she's this all-powerful guidance counsellor, go the full fucking 9 yards. Don't make her only appearances be on this dumbass road to rule with observative recaps of every quest you've done and shit you've taken in the last hour. She plays no part at all in your progression through the story, beside reminding you of what's happening and giving you a very brief insight into the actual villain of the game. Speaking of which, I could not stand the Crawler, or the Darkness, or the My Chemical Romance, or whatever the fuck the villain of Fable 3 was. You don't even find out it's the real villain until the last couple of hours of the story. It's like the game was boring itself so much with its themes of revolution and interesting characters that it needed to erratically slap itself to keep itself awake. So instead of having your comical tyrant brother as the antagonist, we get the Darkness. Your typical sentient goo / evil flubber lifeform that for some reason wants to engulf Albion in its darkness. This concept wouldn't be so bad if it was well executed, but we hardly see anything of it, or him, or them, or whatever weird gender pronoun it has, except for 2 sequences, and for a very short amount of time. The first time you encounter it, the Darkness tries to play this psychological game with you as you escape some cave you happen to stumble on after being shipwrecked, in an attempt to make you leave Walter behind. But there's absolutely no reason why you'd want to do that. You don't gain anything from it. Even if you found out Walter had been banging your girlfriend or something, there'd be some temptation to leave him for dead, but there isn't. So there's literally no way to the evil choices as opposed to the good one. Contrast this to Fable, The Lost Chapters, where in the expansion to the endgame, you have to collect 3 souls to unlock a gate. Jack of Blades, the game's antagonist, who I personally think is one of the best villains in video games, tells you that instead of going through all the trouble of getting the souls the normal way, you can kill the good characters and save yourself a lot of time. It was a decision that I took into consideration, even if it was just for a few moments. I don't know why or how the last Fable game could turn out this way. I mean, it had everything it needed and a great concept for a story, but it was just so poorly executed that it falls flat on its face. Anyways, after you eventually take the throne in one of the most anticlimactic sieges in video games, you find out that Logan was only been a tyrant in order to save enough money and do what was needed to be ready for when the Darkness came for the rest of Albion. And while I really like the explanation as to why Logan was being a tyrant instead of him just being flat out evil, this transition of one main villain to the next is so sudden and poorly timed it's hard to appreciate. Also, when I say anticlimactic, I don't mean because it didn't have enough Michael Bay in it, I just mean because it came so soon, there was no build up at all. There are a few times where Walter or some other characters will say something along the lines of, "This revolution is just beginning," or "We're just getting warmed up," or "The real work is yet to come." But just a couple of short hours later, you're battling for Albion. What the fuck? Were the writers that bored that they had to hurry it along? I give up with this game. The story's so backwards it makes my head spin. Mass Effect 2 had a very good story because it nails the same concept of a big build up to a meaningful finish and set sex joke here. And that the game was released almost 11 months earlier than Fable 3. Fable 2 had a great build up and a great end too, and so did the first Fable, albeit not as good as the second. So what was their excuse? Could they really not look at other games? Fuck, look at their own games for quality comparison? In fact, it feels kind of odd to me that the ending of Fable 3 is very similar to Mass Effect 2. The idea of building up against the odds to defeat an omniscient threat to the human race by balancing out what's right and what's best. It's almost as if Lionhead looked at the game last minute and went, "Ooh, that looks cool, let's have something like that," and completely thrown in the Darkness at the end to be more of a threatening antagonist to Logan. But they already designed and wrote most of the story, so they left it in without altering it to even hint that maybe the Darkness was a thing before you found out it was real. I'm just speculating. I very much doubt that that kind of thing happened and the game was planned from the start, but it would explain why the whole endgame felt so rushed. Let's talk about that actually. I will say I like how Fable 3 acknowledges the actions of your character in 2, since I don't feel like there was enough mention of the original hero in Fable 2, considering he fought substantially more powerful foes and did things that would shape the world as we come to know it. Though once again, I didn't like how it forced the notion that no matter what kind of character you played in the second game, you end up as King or Queen of Albion and have 2 sons, one of whom is a dickhead. Especially when the supposed appeal about the Fable games has always been the idea of giving the player ability to make decisions. Lionhead knew this was the appeal too, since they dedicated the entire last 20% of the game to making them. The game kind of does a good job here. You're faced with a lot of decisions in the throne room that slightly impact the ending of the game. In fact, these are the only decisions you make in the game that ultimately matter to a certain degree. These decisions, however, are all based purely on how much you're willing to spend to keep the promises you were forced to make to win the support of your followers. They're not exactly complex moral or ethical dilemmas that you can solve through dialogue and reasoning, and neither of your decisions include the option to say, right, I'll do this now, and then when we fend off the Darkness, I'll do this instead. Instead, you deliver one of 2 verdicts that will either grant your treasury more money and reduce the predicted loss of life, but you will make your people vilify you, or vice versa. A lot of these cases are disputed by Reaver, the egotistical hero of skill from the second game. Now, I loved his character the first time we see him. He's cocky, enigmatic, and fits the roguish archetype very well. But in this game, he's just an industry baron with loads of money who tries to get you to save more money through buying into his corrupt sweatshop and environmental destruction policies. He does a good job of delivering his lines as most of the voice actors do, but his character is such an unconvincing and boring downgrade to the last time we saw him that the game made me want to do all of the good decisions just to spite him. We first see him as a suave and charismatic but egocentric rogue who shows little empathy for others and helps the hero of Bowerstone only because he gets his house destroyed by Lucian. Here, he's certainly charming in some ways, but he's mostly just portrayed as being an arsehole and unlikable, so it removes all of the charm he initially had straight off the bat. Anyway, I think I've said all that needs to be said on the story, but just in case any of my gibbering confused you, the game had a poor start, mediocre middle, and disappointing end, and the memorable characters and satirical writing are its only merits. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to expand on it some more. In Fable 3, you have a voice actor for your character. I always thought this was an odd move on the part of Lionhead, the same way I thought it was odd in Fallout 4. The lines are delivered well enough for the start of the game, but the voice actor only adds fuel to the same problematic fire I mentioned earlier, that there's no progression in this game. Your character has the voice of an adolescent teenager, kind of a lot like me, and they had to make everything take place over the span of a short amount of time to make up for it. I feel as if this adds to the fact that the endgame feels rushed, and I'll try to explain how those two correlate as best I can. As I said previously, the end of Fable 3 has you make a handful of decisions over the course of a year that will dictate the outcome of the battle between your kingdom and the darkness. I feel as if it was written to be exactly 365 days until the darkness attacks to account for the fact that the voice actor wouldn't fit an old grizzled king that has been preparing for years. Imagine this, instead of the time limit to the final battle being a year, why not 5 years, 10, 20? That way the game could have had more decisions, basic as they might be, more chances to see how those decisions play out into later choices, and further put you in the same shoes as Logan. Maybe you make some choices in the first 2 years that don't sit well with the people, another resistance pops up, and you have to deal with them at the same time. Maybe political relations with other cities break down and you have to do things to mend them. Or maybe you could just put that time to gathering more money since the game asks for an obscene 6.5 million gold in order to minimise the casualties. Without using glitches or cheating methods, this is a hard figure to get to without being a total bastard and breaking every promise. And I don't think that's fair. I think the game should have allowed more of a strategic approach that let you balance it out more. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood had a system where you could send agents into the world to do missions with a percentage of success depending on how experienced and leveled they are, and completion of these missions brings back more money and rewards to use. Brotherhood was a month after Fable 3, but I see no reason why Lionhead couldn't have incorporated something similar, and it would have made so much more sense considering you're the King of Albion. You would have came out having a much fairer chance that actually depended on your ability to rule instead of the choice to spend more money or make people mad. The build-up would have been bigger and thus more satisfying, the character progression that was sorely missing from the game would have been included, but no. To make up for the fact that the character's age is frozen in time with the voice actor's performance, the endgame takes place over a year. It's not even a long year either, the whole thing is one quest that is broken down into a few days. In fact, the final decision you get to make takes place 129 days before the invasion and then it immediately skips to the day the invasion takes place. The game lets you taste the power of being a king and giving sentences for a bittersweet hour or so before it's all over again, and it baffles me as to why, since this is what we've been working towards the entire game anyways. Let's talk about the art style. The only issue I have with the art style of this game is that in a lot of ways it feels like it's a very different game from the other two. Visually both Fable 2 and 3 are similar, but in my opinion they took the Victorian aesthetic that Fable 2 had and ramped it up to 11. You can see a clear descent from Fable 1's high fantasy art style to Fable 2's Victorian fantasy to Fable 3's Victorian England. I personally prefer the high fantasy style, and I think Fable 2 did the best job of balancing them, making Albion still look and feel like its own separate fantasy world. We see this transition most clearly in Bowerstone, the fictional capital city of all three games. Fable 1 representation is very medieval, very bright and very colourful. Fable 2's version is much of the same but on a larger scale, putting on a slightly darker colour palette that fits the game's tone perfectly, and the architecture of the buildings is, as I mentioned earlier, a great mix of fantasy and Victorian. Every building in Fable 2 was and is unique, and I enjoyed stuff as simple as walking through the streets, performing in front of people, playing pub games, all sorts of insignificant things that help bring the city in this game to life. Fable 3's version of Bowerstone takes a starkly different approach. There's next to no fantasy elements present here, and it's a crying shame. It's a dark and dingy aesthetic that sure fits the tone of the game, but juxtaposes massively when put next to its predecessors. I never felt the urge to explore a single house or building in Bowerstone, whereas I couldn't help but wander into random homes just to see what was there in the second. The art style of the UI is minimalistic, in the sense that it just doesn't fucking exist. You ever see those people who are the type of pedants who believe in the white rabbit in a snowstorm theory that art is purely subjective, and a white sheet of paper is art despite the fact that nothing is put on it? That's what Molyneux must have thought when he decided not to have as much as a health bar in this time. He made this decision proudly and boasted, "Why do we need the fucking health bar?" To which I say, if your video game involves dealing and taking damage in any sense, include a fucking way to track how much health you have left. It's been an unspoken rule since the first timeless classics began. Fair enough, I didn't get a chance to play those games as a kid, but hey, I'm just a big stupid entitled millennial. How dare I expect the most basic of game mechanics to be in one of the most basic RPGs? Did Molyneux ever play a video game as a child? Or did he just play Mario and think, well, this game has no health bar, and roll with the notion that his game suddenly didn't need one either? The game tried to go for this less is more kind of feel to it, and it backfired in every way. In terms of the UI, less may sometimes be more, but none is still none. And for anyone that tried to defend the decision to have no health bar by the fact the game shows you your potions when you lose too much health, please leave. Showing me that I have potions once I start needing them isn't the same as just having a fucking health bar that tells me when I should take it or help me decide if I should even take one at all. Peter didn't want any distractions for the player, no UI to take up space on the screen to get in the way of the game's visuals. Sounds okay, a lot of games can be enjoyed with less HUD this way, Zelda Breath of the Wild being one of the more recent examples, but the fucking breadcrumb trail makes another return and takes away the glory from the visuals anyway, so what was the point? It sounds stupid that the glowing breadcrumb trail would make the visuals harder to notice since it takes up such little space on the screen, but it does this in the same way Mirror's Edges did, except far less efficiently. There are numerous ways to artificially guide a player down a certain path, from your poor man's distant markers and compass-based objectives, to your Mirror's Edge runner's vision, which shows you likely ways you can progress through the level. In my humble man's opinion, I think in open world RPG games such as Fables, quest objectives should be vague, not in how they're described but in how they're shown on screen. Despite this, I'm a fan of Mirror's Edge's version of a minimal UI, even though its art style included bright red obstacles which tell the player where they should probably be going, and it also had no HUD. Its minimalistic art style was well executed and bold enough to stand out in its own way. In fact, ironically, the fact that red objects are so prominent mean you take in more of the visuals since you'll be looking infrared so much. But having a literal trail that is constantly there holding your hand down corridors and environments, I can't think of anything more distracting. This is the same type of visual appeal as watching a progress bar. You just stare at the same thing until something happens like combat or a brief interaction with an NPC. I have to say, while I don't think that its inclusion was needed and it goes a little overboard, I did like the idea of having the sanctuary be a dynamic menu. I just wish it was handled better. This is just speculation, but I imagine this also adds to the already really long loading times for the game, since the game will have to load an instance of the sanctuary each time you enter a new zone. That's all I'm going to say on this. I feel as everything that needs to be said on the sanctuary has already been said to death. It was a good idea, but it was a stupid one still. Finally, let's talk about the music. The music in Fable 3 is fantastic, but for one reason. 70% of it is from the first two games. I'm not kidding, the amount of times I heard some remastered version of a track from the first game, or I'd hear a track that was just straight up ripped from the second, was ridiculous. To be fair, I might not have noticed it as much had I not just finished Anniversary a day before starting my playthrough, but I did notice it, and it kind of threw me off. It just struck me as laziness and cheapness from Lionhead not wanting to pay Russell Shaw to make more captivating music and rely on the amazing work he'd already done. Any tracks that weren't from these two games aren't memorable, partly due to the fact from the first two games outshines whatever's there, and partly because this game is pretty lackluster to begin with. I'm sure if I listened to the same tracks on a better game they'd have more room to shine. I mean, Russell Shaw is a talented musician and I love his work, but there's just no breathing room for it here and it's a shame. Last thing I want to talk about is the Road to Rule. I wouldn't say I hated it, it's another one of those cases of pure misjudgment and poor iteration of the concept of a menu dynamic you can interact with from Lionhead, but still I don't like it. This game goes against the formula that the first two games offered, where depending on the way you kill an enemy with a ranged weapon, melee weapon or magic, you would get experience points that let you level different parts of each skill. The Bethesda games do this to a far more effective degree in the Elder Scrolls series, particularly Skyrim, but here you work towards getting guild seals instead, a form of experience currency you use to unlock chests which grant you more powers. But it's more than just that. They dumbed down the progression system to the point where you don't do damage based on skill but how many of the 5 chests you've opened for a particular skill set so far, and there's no reason to switch them up and keep it dynamic, since all 3 types are effective against all types of enemies. Having dyes as something you unlock later in the game is also pretty bullshit to me. You want to customise your character? You have to wait and hope the particular dye you're looking for is in the next section of the road to rule and you need to sit through another couple of hours of gameplay before you can do it. Want to do more with an NPC than just shake their hand or fart on their face? Gotta pay up in experience points, man. Fable 1 had you unlock new interactions over time, with some only unlocking at certain levels of alignment. But even then, just like in Fable 2 where you can buy expressions from book vendors, you still start out with more than a bare handful of ways to interact with people. It's like they had to compromise for the fact that instead of having a lot of chests with varying abilities in combat, they decided to just cut out some random parts of the game and put them in the empty chests. Why does this game go backward on itself the whole time? Having a visual representation of how much of the game you have left is also pretty stupid. The game is short enough without a visual indication that you're not getting your money's worth to insult you about it. Then again, the whole game was like that. It started out in development with the end in sight before it even took off. Peter Molyneux had a vision for a role-playing game that reinvented the genre, and he had some great ideas for this game that I think would have went down well with a better execution and a consistency that matched the series it was continuing. Playing these games after so long reminds me that there'll always be some magic in the world of Albion for me to see and explore, but I don't think I'll ever experience it again in this version. This is the first kind of video that I do like this, but I doubt it'll be the last. If you like this video, please become a friend and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed my rambling about a game that was made 7 years ago.